reaping the benefits of it. I would tell you the other uniqueness from the perspective of us here in the Army Cyber is we have tremendous senior leader support. Whether or not it's been previous secretaries of the Army, chiefs of staff of the Army, the current acting secretary of the Army, or the chief of staff of the Army today, there is tremendous emphasis on what we do in cyberspace. And you say, how is that so? It's so because if you take a look at the ability for us to garner resources, both money and talent, we have been very, very fortunate in terms of the focus that our senior leadership has provided to us. But the other thing I would say is that we've also been a benefit of in-house capabilities. If you take a look at where we're at today, the development of infrastructure, the development of a resourcing strategy, the development of our own schoolhouse, these are all in-house things that the Army has done that has been very beneficial to what we're doing. And so as we begin today, what I would like to do is to show a quick video in terms of where we're at today with the Army Cyber writ large, and then come back to a series of questions. So please, if you'd roll the video.
My associate's degree in intelligence studies, and I have also continued pursuing my bachelor's in cybersecurity. I am Staff Sergeant Stanek, and I work in the United States Army Cyber Command.
Cyberspace operations is just a world of opportunity for anyone that wants to get involved. I am Chief Warrant Officer Mullins, and I work with U.S. Army Cyber Command. Our senior leaders and commanders are working with industry to ensure our warfighters are provided the best cutting-edge technology in defense of our networks for the future warfighter.
If you go back when we first started doing this about 10 years ago, we found that the military folks had less experience in the cyber realm. It has been a huge change in the last 10 years. And now when we run these classes, we find that the military personnel are among the best trained, the most aware. It's really been a sea change, and it's refreshing.
It's extremely exciting to think that I don't have to only fight fires, I get to be involved with a cyber event. We want to understand before the event happens how we're going to respond and how we integrate together. You definitely don't want to learn who your partner is or who to go to during an event. We want to know who our partners are, who we're going to work with, what resources you have and what resources I have, and how we can attack the problem together instead of finding it out after the fact.
Here at the Cyber School, we think it's very important to harness the interests of the students. It fosters a climate of creativity and allows for out-of-the-box thinking, which is essential to be successful in the cyber field.
I joined the cyber branch of the military because ever since I was a kid, I've always loved computers, and I in fact wanted to design video games as a kid, and I felt that joining cyber would be the best step towards going about achieving that dream.
I'm PFC Morales, and I joined the 17 Charlie branch because I wanted to challenge myself mentally. I've always been someone that's been driven by self-improvement, and I figured that no matter how much you learn in this cyber field, there's always more.
For any young professional that wants to pursue a career in cyberspace operations, the time is now, the opportunities are endless, and the rewards are priceless.
Okay, so as we start off, not a bad video. What I would like to do now is to ask the panelists to just do a short introduction of themselves and a little bit about background on what they've done and why they're here today. So, John?
So my name is John Morrison. I'm the commander of the Cyber Center of Excellence in Fort Gordon. Essentially what my background is, I started off as a signal officer. My two most recent commands have been the 7th Signal Command Theater that does all the networks here in the Western Hemisphere, and then its parent organization, Network Enterprise Technology Command. As a part of my tenure in NetCom, who was responsible for all DODN operations across the globe, we also built the Cyber Protection Brigade, so got more than just a little bit of experience on the defensive cyber operations front. What we're responsible for at Fort Gordon is the customer is General Nakasone and Army Cyber. We are the producer. So we're responsible for developing not only the capabilities that we hand over to Army Cyber, but more importantly, and what we're here to talk about today, it's people. So we handle all the accessions and in all the training for all cohorts. And by all cohorts, I mean officer, warrant officer, and enlisted, reserve component and active component, and DA civilian. And then we transition those folks over to U.S. Army Cyber, where we can get them on net as rapidly as possible. I look forward to your questions today, and I look forward to a great session.
Thanks, John. Mr. Filippelli.
Thank you, sir. Guy Filippelli, as General Nakasone said, I started off my career as an Army officer for 9 years, MI officer before Cyber Command existed, but ran software teams for 5 of those years, culminating in a year in Afghanistan, and then at NSA, where I became the tech lead for a really phenomenal program called RTRG, and did that in Baghdad. And then I built first thing was a software services company, 5 years, called Berico Technologies, grew it, and eventually exited it, spun out a couple companies, invested in some software companies, and then launched a new company in 2012 called Red Owl, based in Baltimore and New York and San Francisco, and raised a bunch of money and sold it about 3 weeks ago. And so along the way, why I'm here, I've learned a lot about what it's like to try to be technical in the Army. I've learned a lot about how that compares and contrasts with how to be successful at that in the private sector. Probably made a bunch of mistakes along the way, but really, really happy to provide as much perspective as I can. Thanks.
Thanks, Guy. General Hager.
Great. My name's Steve Hager. I'm actually a native of Silicon Valley. I was actually born and raised there. I went on active duty in 1989 and worked at Fort Meade as my first assignment. And then I left active duty in 1994 and became a traditional reservist. And I did the traditional things that a signal officer would do in the Army Reserves. But on my technical side, I had a number of startups. Some of them were successful, some of them were not. And so what I bring to the table as a person from Silicon Valley with my business background and running technical companies and seeing how small startups would scale to bigger companies or even IPO, the leadership needs to change, right? And so as a traditional Signal Corps officer, I've made it through the ranks because I took the difficult command jobs in the Signal Corps. I was a battalion commander, brigade commander, one of General Baker's theater signal commanders, as General Nakasone said. And so when he asked me for an opportunity on what I would like to do, I said, well, I'd like to do an operational cyber assignment. And so now I'm the Deputy Commander of Operations for the Cyber National Mission Force. And the reason why I think that's important is I view this as a great startup opportunity. We're growing the cyber force, and the cyber force that we have today, version 1.0, just like in a startup company, is not the cyber force that we need tomorrow when we want to make it a professional core. And we have to figure out how to do that within the confines of DoD, and maybe some of the policies need to change. So that's why I'm here. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Mr. Lynch.
Hi, my name is Chris Lynch. I head up a team called Defense Digital Service, and my team has a very unique and interesting challenge. I try to convince people to come from the tech sectors all over the United States to work on problem sets and challenges that are unlike anything else that they can experience in their day-to-day jobs from where they come. Work on things that matter, things that have impact. And I think that that's one of the most interesting things about where we are today, at least with the Department of Defense. I come from a family with no background in government, no background in military. But I do believe that everybody believes deeply in the problem sets that we face and the things that we work on here. And so I get them to come from, Silicon Valley or any of the other tech hubs. They come for 1 to 2 years on what I endearingly refer to as a SWAT team of nerds, software engineers, right? To bring a skill set into the Department of Defense that has traditionally left the building or been pushed off into the furthest regions without necessarily the ability to fall into leadership positions or do things that actually use their skills successfully. And that is one of the things that we focus on quite a bit, is bringing in great talent. We partnered with General Nakasone and ARCYBER around a number of different endeavors. Our most famous program is one called Hack the Pentagon, if you can imagine what that was like when we pitched that name. Essentially, we brought in people, anybody in the United States, to come and hack us. Because we wanted to prove that there are different and new ways to think about doing cyber. And so that has been incredibly successful. So I look at the programs and the projects that we pick are all focused around the idea that technical people and technical decisions will ultimately lead to better, more effective forces and let us be more successful in the mission of defense.
Thank you very much, Chris. So ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you that we are past the days of white cards and pencils, that we would ask for questions to come in to the text numbers that are there or at the microphone today for you extroverts. But please feel free to come in with a series of questions. And as they come in, let me begin by just a series of thoughts and then some follow-up questions. So this year has been an incredibly important year for the Army cyber enterprise writ large. Operationally, we have finished our build of 41 teams, a year ahead of the DoD and U.S. Cyber Command mandated 30 September 2018. We continue to operate offensively against ISIS in northern Iraq and Syria with great effect. We have continued SEMA support to Corps and below. The idea of how do we provide IO, cyber, and EW effects at a brigade combat team at a combat training center location. And the final thing is that we have also moved on to a total force solution. So the Army has built 41 active teams, 21 teams now, in addition to that, will be in the reserve component, 10 in the U.S. Army Reserve and 11 in the Army National Guard. But it's not only been on the operational side that I think that this has been such an important year, it's also been on the institutional side. And as John will talk to in just a second here, our cyber military occupation skill force now numbers 2,200 plus. That's cyber and electronic warfare soldiers. Last year, 500 soldiers graduated the Cyber Center of Excellence. This year, and the years forth, we'll push that number to 1,000. We've also graduated our first enlisted class. So this year means that we have trained, as John mentioned, all 3 cohorts: officer, warrant officer, and enlisted. So truly, this has been a very monumental year in the development of the Army cyber enterprise. And as we begin with that, if I might return to General Hager's point about being 1.0 in terms of where we're at. Steve, I'd like to give you an opportunity just to reflect on what you've seen both in the Army Reserves and now at your time at the National Mission Force. And what has it been from the private sector that has been so helpful for you to advance us from 1.0 to 2.0 and beyond?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So cyber is a team sport. So in Silicon Valley, I'm with a bunch of technical guys, and we're focused on a really technical problem. But when I go and recruit my team, I ask them a couple of questions. They know some technology, but more importantly, I ask them, what are they passionate about? And it doesn't matter what they're passionate about, but I ask them how they define their passion for whatever that event is or whatever that topic is. And so when I gather a group of really smart people that are passionate about something, and then I give them a problem set, and I say, if you can be passionate about solving that problem, building a product or whatever, and they work together, they're going to achieve great things. And you give them a little bit of guidance, and they execute. And in the Cyber National Mission Force, that's what I see. I see a lot of very smart people. They're not all just technical folks. There's a number of mathematicians and computer scientists like myself, but we do that more to have a common lexicon, right? And so when I see from industry, technical folks like to use jargon, And then in the military, we have our own set of jargon, and I hate to say this, even the MI Corps, they have their own set of jargon. So part of our job is translating it. But when it gets down to building a team and retaining that team, it's really about how well you interact with your teammates and that you're adding worth to it, right? So if I have a startup company and I'm going to get them to create a product in a very quick amount of time, how do I energize them to do that? And it comes down to having that same mission focus and that passion. And being able to work together is very, very important. So I see that at the Cyber Mission Force, Cyber National Mission Force, and I also like to draw this other analogy. So when I had a startup company, it's a different type of leadership that we would have. If we were going to scale that company to be a little bit larger, I may change some of that leadership, which is often difficult for some of the folks that we have. And then if I were to IPO or make it a public company, that's a completely different set of leadership in general, right? Because you have to scale the company and you have to worry about lots more of legal and policy things. And I think the Cyber National Mission, or the Cyber Mission Force, is going to go through that natural evolution. So I do not believe that cyber as a domain itself is any more special than the other domains. I think as we start out with it, we have to incubate it and make sure that it's built to a way where I have what I call a cyber core, C-O-R-E, a group of people who understand what it's going to do, and they're going to spread through the rest of the forces, and they'll understand the goodness and what cyber can bring to the multi-domain fight. And then we have to develop the cyber core, C-O-R-P-S, where we professionalize it. We have KD jobs and those types of positions. And I don't see that any different than when I do that with a small startup company and I want to scale it to be a publicly run company. It's an evolution of change. Is that good, sir?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So, Chris, you have made a name for yourself in the department by breaking down walls and moving around bureaucracy and avoiding bureaucratic shutdowns. What I would like to pose to you are, what are the walls that we've created for our own talent management? And what have you seen in terms of change that's necessary for us to break down those walls and to get around that bureaucracy?
That's a good question. It's interesting. The talent that we think about when you look at a really good software engineer, there are challenges to how we see traditional military structures and how they can be applied to that talent. As an example, earlier this year, myself and one other person on General Nakasone's teams went and we met with about 200 different cyber soldiers, looking at things to understand their backgrounds, right? Just for me to also get a baseline to be able to compare them to the types of engineers that I would bring in from companies that you would think of that run the biggest machines on the internet. And it's really interesting. Some of the best engineers, they started long before school. They started writing code when they were in maybe junior high or high school. Maybe they were just tinkering at that time, but that's a really interesting thing because at some point after that, the spark gets lit up, right? And it becomes something far more of a drive for them. And that is what I think is interesting about software engineers. It's different than anything else. My belief is that you really can't make someone a great software engineer, right? You can find them and you can give them all the education in the world to actually further craft that. But that's a very different model, meaning that you can't just take somebody off the street and make them great. You have to find the great people and attract them. And I like to contrast that to sort of where we've been in the Department of Defense. At one point in the Department of Defense, if you wanted to work on encryption in the world, right, you went to the NSA. That was it. That was the place you went. And I remember when I was a kid, I remember the term military grade technology. And people wouldn't chuckle like that guy just did, right? Right? And I think of those things because we're now competing with a world that is unlike anything else. All those companies that run the things that power the apps on your phones, all those companies that build the things that are doing your transactions to pay your friend for dinner last night, we compete for those people. And the people who build those things have, long before they ever showed up at those jobs, started to craft and hone that skill, which I think is interesting. So when I think of the challenges that we face and the traditional barriers, we have to be willing to let go of the idea of a couple things. One, nerds sometimes just like to be nerds. They don't want to be leaders, right? And we have a concept that in order to be a great leader within our military, that you have to what? You have to let go of the individual contributor role. Well, that doesn't work. I literally had somebody on one of my teams years ago who told me that he was fine working out of a closet. He said, please don't put me near people. And he was one of my best engineers. Now think about that. We would let that person go. That's crazy. We need to build a place where this type of work has a home and we don't push these people out. So having technical tracks and breaking down the idea that you have to just be a leader to be part of the Army and have these authorities.
Thanks, Chris. So, Guy, I would follow up with a question the audience has asked, which I think is quite appropriate here. So what role, based upon your experiences, do you see industry playing in developing a workforce? And what have you experienced based upon the development of such a workforce? And what can we learn from their industry's development of talent management and future acquisition?
Sure. So, so first of all, my experience in the industry is I've probably hired, 200 software engineers in the last 10 years in some shape or form, and really personally interacted with a lot of them. So I have formed some opinions about what works, what doesn't, and why. And one thing I'll tell you, from sort of just the other thing to recognize in the private sector is the private sector is a really ugly place right now in general for technical talent. There is a massive demand problem, and what certain companies, you think about who do you really want to copy? What certain companies like Google do is they pay a ton of money to beat the demand curve. And so the question I think you have to ask yourself as the military, as a cyber force in the military, is who do you really want to mimic? I don't think we want to mimic Google because Google does it through money. Is my general thesis, and Steve may disagree and Chris may disagree, but you want to really mimic the kind of scrappy startups that don't have a lot of money and have to wheel and deal to get that first team of 20 or 30 or 50 in the door. And the thing that I find that they have as the things that have always gotten us to get our best people. One, it's all about the initial core, and then it's all about their ability in sort of almost like a very decentralized way to hire around them. I've always found that my most successful teams built their own team. Now that's really hard to do, but how can you somehow push the recruiting and the vetting down to the unit level? I don't know how the heck you do that, but it's where I've always found that the most high-performing teams come out of. People didn't just show up and it was like all of a sudden, hey, do work for me, right? The other thing that's interesting is you have to recognize that the private sector has some advantages that you're probably not going to get, like the hire and fire advantage. We don't go out in the private sector and say, we got to hire 20 people and just know that we're going to have to work with those 20 people for the next 5 years. We go in with the mindset of we might hire 30 and eventually end up with 20 that we really liked, and I don't know how, it's almost like one of the interesting learning lessons for the military might be how quickly can you get rid of people as a measure of success in some sort, because that's probably something that doesn't exist. And then the other thing is just where do we find people? I think the companies that are being very successful right now are definitely getting people early. They're getting their best people on internships when they're in grad school and when they're in undergrad, and how do you make sure you're really targeting there? Just in general, I would say that I'll close it with this thought, the single biggest reason for retention that I have found amongst my engineers over the last 10 years is when they have great respect for their direct supervisor, number one, and their peers, number two. And I mean technical respect. When they have technical respect for their direct supervisor, it's fundamentally the biggest thing. And my guess, and this is just in my own, talking with lots of junior military officers over the last few years, that's the one thing we struggle with, because not many, frankly, of the next tier up tend to have some of those technical experiences. And so just a few random thoughts to
Thanks,
start
Guy.
there.
So when we have difficult challenges in Army Cyber, in the Army Cyber Enterprise, we turn to John Morrison. So I'm going to turn to John Morrison as follow-up from those comments. John.
So Guy, I really appreciate those comments. I think most of them are absolutely spot on. But I want to highlight an opportunity where truly what's happened across the cyber enterprise is really challenging traditional Army thinking. And the one that really struck me the most is when you talked about how do you push down accessions almost to where the operational formation get to vote. So one of the things that I truly don't think that the Army realized what a brilliant decision they made deciding that they were going to put Army Cyber down at Fort Gordon with the institutional arm when General Odierno, who is a brilliant man, made that decision 4 or 5 years ago. Because the second and third order effects that are starting to come out of that are pretty significant, to where the institution, unlike any place else in our Army, gets immediate operational feedback on what is happening and the qualities to which we need to be training folks. And so now we can set up a paradigm where literally, and I'll point to Paul Stanton, who's the Cyber Protection Brigade commander, can come over to the schoolhouse and meet folks that are now going through training, and we can do the same thing on the offensive side, and we can get a sense for where is the best place to excuse the pun, to place somebody. And where will they fit best inside Army cyber forces? And so that's a unique paradigm shift. I'm not going to tell you it's completely mature, but it is maturing. What we need to work through now is how do we bring that to the front end of the accessions process so that it's almost a joint look from both the operational side and from the institutional side that takes a look at a candidate that's coming in and there's an agreement on the front end that, yep, this is somebody that we want to bring in and take on some of this training. The other thing that I will tell you is inside the cyber enterprise, to get after your other point, we're not seeing the traditional, we've got to get everybody through the course. Not inside the cyber mission, not inside the Army Cyber Forces. They've got to meet joint certifications. And if they are unable to meet that, then they're not going to stay a 17. You're really not a 17, a cyber operator, until the conclusion of the course. That is also a different paradigm because that's usually not how we do this. There's usually recycles and other things so that we can take the investment that we made and try and get somebody through. But in this space, where you really need to be able to be a self-starter and operate on your own, that's just not the right model.
Thanks, John. So I'd like to return to Steve. And Steve Hager, question comes in from audience member. So really, what are the core tenets as you take a look at recruiting and retaining soldiers within Army Cyber Forces?
Core tenets. Well, sorry. I guess there are more attributes. I wouldn't necessarily say they're core tenets. It's mission purpose, right? So you got to have a real good purpose, and like you said, you want to make sure that you don't only respect your leadership and the mission you're doing, but you also want to be acknowledged by your peers, right? And you get that in the tech sector too. So to comment on what you said about not just having command jobs, we do allow folks to be technical directors, at least at the National Mission Force. So we do understand the ability to allow people to do these technical things. And in the tech sector, you kind of see that, right? Lots of the good technical folks that stay technical are more introverted. And those that have the ability to speak publicly and so forth, I hate to say this, they go to marketing, right? So one of the things that—
I resent that.
Yeah. So then inherently they're not going to be as technical, right? But the one thing I'd like to say is when you want to develop that really technical force, and this is something that I think is interesting, is in Silicon Valley, a lot of the companies, they generally get rid of 10 to 15% of their workforce every year to bring in new blood, right? And I think in the military and the government, that's a hard thing to think about because we're kind of a pyramid structure. So you go, if I'm going to do that, it's always at the lower end of the spectrum. And I think maybe we should do that at some of the senior positions too. Now,
appreciate that, Steve.
I'm always a little.
General Hager's looking for a promotion.
Yeah, self-interest.
No, not at all, sir. So first thing is, I think competition's good, right? So we often worry about, hey, I'm losing my active duty soldiers. I invested all this money into them, and they leave. And I go, hey, if you get a better opportunity, you should take it up. And so I think one of the things we should be willing to do is allow our workforce to permeate. So if they go to the private sector for a number of years, why don't we take them back? Because they're coming back with this great skill set. So as a Compo 2, Compo 3 guy, reserve or guard guy, I go, now that's my responsibility when an active duty soldier leaves that we invested all this money in. And so one of the things I'll say, and some people have heard me say this, so the United States military is the greatest military on earth, and I'm a proud member of it, but it's not the most important thing to our nation. The most important thing to our nation is our economic might. So if the U.S. Army spends time training a young soldier or officer to learn about cybersecurity, and they leave active duty and they go work for Walmart or, say, Equifax, or something that will help secure our economic, I want to say dominance, but our economic ability to grow our GDP, well, I think that's a great thing, right? Now, if they work for another company or a different country, I'd be a little upset. But then it's my job to go recruit them and say, hey, how can you still support the force when you do things as a reserve or guardsman? Another thing I like to say, sir, is when we talk about that permeability, you want to bring in folks that have great technical skills. So you always have to have a core of people who understand the military, right? General McGee told me this. He said, so I grew up in California, and I'm a deer hunter. So as a young kid, I knew we hunt deer a little differently on the East Coast, or on the West Coast than you do on the East Coast. We climb up on a hill, we take our binoculars, we look for the deer, and then we go stalk them, right? It's called glassing and stalking. So I have the technical skills to walk around, go through the woods without being detected, engage my target a couple hundred meters, and take it out. That does not qualify me to be a sniper in the United States Army. And why is that? Because we work as a team. So I have that skill set. So I'm a great Unix hacker, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm qualified to be a 17 series. I may have those technical skills, but those things to work as a team, because remember, cyber is not done for cyber itself, while hacking may be done for hacking itself. We have to understand how the skill set translates to how the Army or the Joint Force operates, right? So it's good to identify those folks that have those skill sets, but we have to remember you need a professional military force to put them in the right domain. And when I think how we talk about the permeability, if we look at how Compo 2, Compo 3 does things, we can look at that force to bring in those new ideas. And the reason I say that in Silicon Valley, since I grew up and raised there, I've seen a number of new career fields come out. So it's a brand new thing. First it was semiconductors, then it was software, then it was web-based stuff, then social media. These are all new things. Well, where do you go to get the expertise? There is no expertise out there. There's a few academic people, but then you go to people who have a track record of picking up a new technology and monetizing it and commercializing it and moving it through. And so that's the ecosystem that they've built out in the Valley. And so there's no issue with people working for a company for a few years and then moving on. And the problem I've seen is I've had senior people tell me, well, they're not dedicated to that company. Just like if I don't do 20 or 30 years in the military. And I go, you're right, they're not dedicated to a company, they're dedicated to the advancement of technology. Just like we have many people who are dedicated to the defense of this nation, you don't always have to do it in uniform. You could do it in other ways, and maybe you don't do it all the time. So I think the permeability to allow people to go off and do stuff in industry that maybe have nothing to do with defense, but they're learning a lot of new stuff about quantum computing or something that's new, and then we have the ability to bring them back in to then help us be force multipliers.
Thanks, Steve. Hey, Chris, interesting question here. A question comes in from the audience. What are your plans and venues for inspiring collaborative innovation? What's next?
Wow, there's so much there. One of the interesting things about the Department of Defense is it is really, really big. As a matter of fact, I talk about that every time I do a recruiting call, and I meet potential candidates to come in. I mentioned just the size and the scope, and I always talk about how many people work for the Department of Defense, how we build cities, we build everything, literally everything, all the way down to tanks, right? Like you just think about it and it's mind-blowing. So how do you improve that? Well, one thing that I do think is very important when you look at, this is more maybe a statement about the United States government writ large, but I'll just focus on the DoD for a second. My team were like this little bastion of sort of, if you were to leave the Department of Defense, you were to go to a startup, we pretty much work the same way. We use the same tools. When we edit a document, we would send it to somebody else in the office, and they edit it together with us in real time. We have a chat thing that we use that every single one of our projects, everybody's in there. We invite people from other parts of the DoD to come in, and they collaborate with us on all that. And to us, that's just how we work. But it's really funny, because it's not how the Department of Defense works. As a matter of fact, when I try to bring a lot of people in from the DoD, it's the tools that we're using are blocked. So then we figure out how to unblock them. Okay, so then we got that. And then, we have multi-factor authentication. Well, they're probably in a SCIF where they can't have their phone, so they can't get the code. So then they have to leave the room, get the code, run back into the room, and then type it really quickly into their computer. And when you actually look at it, it's kind of funny. Because it just shows how we haven't really kept up. And I find that fascinating, because we have to, right? We have to do these things because this is all really, really important, right? Every single decision that we do comes down in some form in a way that we are trusting the information on a screen that is telling us that something is true, and we're verifying the authenticity of where it came from to convey some kind of an action. And I think that that's fascinating, because if you think about it, that means that it all must work and work with 100% trust and be perfect, right? And so therefore we should be exceptional at collaborating. We should be doing the things that you see in any one of the companies that I have started before I showed up at the Department of Defense in the United States government, right? Those things should be what I would call birthright technologies. They should just be the way that they are. But instead, people email documents around, they rename the document, they put their initials on it, -V3, send it back, somebody does their edits, -V4, appends their initials to it. Have you guys seen this? And I look at it and I'm like, that happened a long time ago. That is no longer a thing. Like, that's a solved problem. Imagine that we all walked out of here and you saw horses and buggies and you're like, actually, if you just went a couple blocks down the street, there are cars, right? And I think that that's funny, because when I think of how we do things, we struggle with questions that sometimes are actually kind of, they're kind of irrational arguments. Like, we'll say, well, maybe this isn't secure, but they're like, but the current one's not super secure. And they'll say, yes, I know, but maybe that one's just as good or just as bad. And you're like, that doesn't even make sense. It just is better because I could get all these things. And you look at that, and I really think that when you think about the future of collaboration and how the Department of Defense needs to work and all these things and why this type of talent is important, and I'll just go back to something that I said before. It is extremely important that we pursue a world in which a nerd can sit in the place where a policy or a decision is made about a technical thing and say, actually, that's not a thing. It's okay, right? Like, we don't do that today. And so we end up with a world that, I kid you not, I remember my first day. I walked into the Department of Defense. I walked into the Pentagon. That was weird. And I walked in, and I had no cell phone access, like nothing. And I was like, what? I was like, how do I get a hold of the people who are meeting me? That's crazy. I remember I had somebody show up in my office, and they said, why do you need Wi-Fi in your office? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, that didn't even make sense to me. And that's the world that we're in. The future of collaboration actually just looks like your house. I'm serious. Let that sink in for a second. The future of collaboration in the Department of Defense probably looks like the things that you use in your daily lives. And until we get there, we're at a very, very disadvantaged place, because we don't have policies and bureaucracies in our adversaries that are stopping them from doing things that we stop ourselves.
Thanks, Chris. So, General Morrison, one of the questions that came in is, and I think Jermaine here, how are you teaching leadership in cyber? Traditionally, the more senior you are, the more you know. How are you teaching leaders to handle an inverted pyramid of knowledge and skills when juniors may have greater knowledge?
So that's a great question. I'm still trying to catch up to Chris. Yeah, For the first time, I feel like an old Southern boy, and I'm going to talk real slow compared to my predecessor. So that is a great question. And I'm just going to give you an analogy because it goes back to something that General Hager said a couple seconds ago. And I want to tie in off of the nerd comment that Chris sat there and said. It is a very technical branch. Don't get us wrong. Fully 85% of the folks that are coming into this, at least at the officer and warrant officer level, have some level of a STEM degree. That said, they're still a part of the United States Army, and they've got to be able to think like operators. And what I would submit to you, the vast majority of the folks that we have inside the force today want to be doing operations, want to be challenged, want to be working on the most pressing problems. Now, that said, they are a part of the United States Army. So we do all the standard Common Core leadership training that you do to get people to understand how the Army operates, what leadership is about, and quite frankly, how the Army conducts maneuver operations. And I'll tell you why all three of those are important. When we've been doing these SEMA support core and below pilots, an analogy I got from General Flynn, who was never at a loss for words, was the first time a cyber operator walked in there, I could not understand a word they were saying, and this is back in the day. Couldn't understand a word they were saying. John, I sent them off to the land of misfit toys. And so having that basic leadership piece, understanding how the Army operates, and understanding how the technical effects that Chris was articulating and Steve were articulating can actually impact and support a maneuver commander scheme maneuver is absolutely critical. And so we must teach that. It's taught at each one at the NCO, warrant officer, and officer levels. Now, that said, we have purposely opened up our management policies to allow for the folks that, as Chris so eloquently said, sometimes nerds just want to be nerds. And so it is not the traditional, you must be a company commander, you must be a battalion S3, you must be a battalion commander. We've allowed enough flexibility in the system to take advantage of those unique talents where somebody just does want to be a tool developer. And then what we do is we've established at the DA level, I'm not sure if you want to talk about information dominance or not, sir.
Go ahead.
An information dominance category that allows us to manage folks inside the cyber branch differently. So they're not doing Army competitive category where they're completing across the broad force with folks who may not quite understand the skill sets that they're looking at. You have folks that actually are doing that operational mission who can take advantage and look at the talent that we have and continue to do that. And as you take a look at the promotion rates, significantly, not well, significantly above the Army averages. So it's a process that I think is changing. Now, to go back to that point about where your subordinates may know more than you, I think that no matter what branch you're in, you get to a point where that's going to happen at some point, especially if you've gotten into a leadership role. The key is, inside this branch, we've got to have a train, employ, train methodology that allows our senior leaders, not General Nakasone and myself, Steve, but allows our senior leaders to understand what is still out there so that they can effectively employ the folks that have the skill sets down below them. That's where we've gotten disconnected over the course of time in many regards.
Thanks, John. Guy, you had a follow-up.
I just want to make a comment because I think these are all awesome comments. I think there's one, I'm going to almost call it a dangerous perception thread that could form here, which is that, and I know nobody's implying it, I just am more focused on the perception of it, which is that the notion that nerds want to be nerds, or the notion that sort of, yes, nerds are different, but that I want to be very clear, not every, quote, nerd and not every great software engineer is a good leader. And great engineering teams still, I don't care if you're in the Valley or if you're in Baltimore or if you're in Israel, are run by great engineering leaders, okay? This is a very important distinction. And what does this really mean? What am I trying to get at here? So, I'll just out of personal experience. Yes, there are categories of geeks that don't want to be leaders, and we don't want to try to make them leaders, okay? But even worse, is, you know, a leaderless engineering organization. So the VP of engineering role in a startup is a critical role, right? The guy, I started my last company 5 years ago. I would say that the first few years we were led by a really extremely talented, off the charts, brilliant software engineer who was a good leader. By the way, did great things, got us from 0 to 10. Then we hired, at his request, you talk about a self-aware guy, said, hey, look, I'm not the best guy to go from here to here. We're going to have now 50 engineers. And my former boss is the best engineering manager that I ever had. You need to get him to run this team. And I brought in him. Now, his name's Steve McCall. Steve's a phenomenal software engineer. I think I've never actually really seen him write much code. But he's a phenomenal software leader. He knows how to do code reviews. He knows how to do weekly one-on-ones. You know, things that, and you know, he knows how to hold the engineers extremely accountable. And when that happens, peers start to are very self-aware. So, you know, it's like, you don't want to lose, it's not about losing leadership. Leadership's still super critical in a digital force, but it's a very precise skill set. And how do you get that? Like, my sense is that that's a huge area for the digital service to probably think about how you bring that kind of leadership in. Because, not to insult any of us on the table, but, you know, like, that's a very particular thing. Would you agree with that? I mean, Chris?
Yeah, I want to be clear, because I know that I've been talking about the technical track. That is one part of it. We did a really interesting thing where we took General McGee, Colonel Stanton came with us out to Silicon Valley, and we just went to a bunch of companies that run the internet, the companies that you would know. And there was a really great comment that somebody made at one of the companies, somebody who was a very early leader over at a social networking company. And he just made the comment that the best companies are engineering focused in tech. The best companies. He said, you can just look across the board. The ones that are not, they just don't do well at retaining talent. They have different focuses. They just don't run as well. And I think that that's really really interesting, because, to your point, having great engineering talent is, of course, the lifeblood of doing these things. But then you have to put them into a space with great leadership that people are inspired by, and that includes the leadership, right? People have to have, I call it a beacon. You know, General Nakasone and I have been working together on something where, you know, we talked about the ability to bring in what I would call beacon engineering talent, beacon leadership. And that does drive people, because it makes people want to say, I want to work for that person. I want to work for that woman or that guy, right? I think that that's an incredibly important thing, just as much as the space that you put them in. And it's not about pay. You said that. It's definitely not about the pay. But yeah, for sure.
And I'm just saying that's two kind of beacons, right? There really are. There's two kind of beacons. There's I want to work around that guy or that gal because I know that he or she is a phenomenal software engineer, and I'm going to learn from them. I want that person to be my peer, for sure, because that's a beacon. That's an effect. And then there's, I want to work for that leader. Mm-hmm. And there are two different kind of beacons, whether you're, you know, in any kind of tech company. Yep. So it's just something to remember. Two different very kind of tracks.
So really good points there. And I would like to just transition a bit to the reserve component. As we mentioned early on, the Army has decided and has already begun the build of 21 cyber protection teams, 11 in the National Guard, 10 in the Army Reserve. Steve, from your vantage point, both as active duty soldier and then reserve component soldier, as member of the high-tech industry, in reflecting on what the Army is able to leverage from the reserve component, what would you share with us most?
So, sir, I think version 1.0 of the Army Reserve Cyber Protection Brigade, or ARCOG as they call it, I think it was a very good start. So the number of people they had to get needed TSSCI, so it's very I'll say East Coast centric, right? We have a brigade headquarters here in the National Capital Region. We have a battalion here. We have another one by MIT, great area. Another one out in Carnegie Mellon. One down in San Antonio, which is if you go to San Antonio, the largest employer there is the Department of Defense. And then they have one out there on the West Coast. They say Camp Parks is close to Silicon Valley, but if anybody who grew up there knows it's actually not Silicon Valley. So to recruit people, I think it's important to start that way. So we get to that core, the CORE. But now what I think as a general officer is we have to think 5 to 10 years out. And so what I would do is I would erase the map of where the active duty bases are, because what I'm constantly told from the AGRs and the active duty folks, hey, where should I put my cyber folks? They say Fort Meade, Fort Belvoir, and Fort Gordon, which is a great place. But I think to add depth to our skill set and not replicate what active duty has, we need to diversify our workforce. So I would recommend is you wipe the map off and you go, where is the tech sector growing for IT and cyber skill sets, right? And that's where I want to put my battalions and guard units. Because when that active duty soldier leaves, and as I told you before, I don't think it's bad that they leave, and they go make their 6-7 figure salaries in the industry to make that money, I want to be able to offer them a job there where they work. And the reason why I want to go to that target-rich environment, they're going to jump around from company to company, but they're probably going to stay in that close geographical area. And then when it comes to cyber, they go, well, why do I have to go to Fort Gordon or Fort Meade to do this when it's cyber? I should be able to operate from wherever I'm at. And I think that's one of the things that the reserves could do a lot better. The other thing I think is that we're trying to hit numbers, and we should be a lot more critical about the talent that we recruit. And we should also be willing to let some talent leave if they're not meeting the muster, right? So from the reserve forces, I would look at how we could position ourselves better in the next 5 to 10 years to be additive to what active duty has and not to be replicate of what they have, sir.
Thanks, Steve. So a question comes in, and it's directed towards General Morrison. I'm an electronic warfare soldier. I hear a lot about cyber today, but I understand that as a 29 series soldier, I'm quickly coming to the realization that I'm going to be part of the cyber force. Can you tell me what the future holds for me as a future EW cyber soldier?
So that's a great question. So effective 1 October of next year, our 29 series, our electronic warfare professionals will in fact become a part of the cyber branch. Starting in January, we will roll out a transition course, and this goes across all cohorts, enlisted, warrant officer, and officer, so that we can start training our electronic warfare professionals in the basics of cyberspace operations, primarily from a planning perspective, because our electronic warfare professionals are going to be the face of cyber for the foreseeable future that will be in our brigade combat teams, in our division, and our corps formations. And so it's important that they understand the fundamentals of cyberspace operations so that if we ever deploy some elements out of Army Cyber into their area of operation, they understand how that works. And just as importantly, they can interface with their cyber defenders that come from the signal regiment that are already going to be a part of those formations. They've got that comprehensive standing. As a part of that, we are formalizing SEMA SEMA sections that will be a part of all these formations, which our electronic warfare professionals will be the head of. And that really is to bring together the integration of cyber, EW, signal, information operations, all with the right intelligence underpinnings as we move forward. In the future, as we complete the transition of bringing our current electronic warfare force over, all folks that come into the cyber branch will go through the standard courses that we have today for our cyber operators. And then, on top of that, they'll get some electronic warfare training. That's so that we now have cyber operators who have a complete understanding of how to operate in the electromagnetic spectrum down inside these tactical formations. It will also build a bench for future growth inside the cyber mission force if that individual decides they want to go down that track as well. But it will baseline everybody so we have a common understanding across the 17 series in cyber branch.
Thanks, John. Next question is directed towards Mr. Guy Filippelli, and it says, Mr. Filippelli, based upon your experiences in the Army as a soldier and as an officer, what did you learn that you applied to the private sector, particularly with regards to talent management?
I guess the first thing I would say is, I guess I learned that you can't fake caring, and I think that has always really held true for me. I mean, I've always tried to both exemplify that myself, but hire people that do. And I think that goes a long way, especially, there always comes a time in any kind of working relationship where stress enters the equation. And when you're really trying to extract the last 10% or the next 10% out of a person, when they trust you, when they know you care, you can push them pretty hard. The second thing I would say that lessons that have really stretched through, there's a lot of good things about, I say this all the time, I mean, I'm more in admiration of the United States military since every day I've been outside of it. You're talking about a 1 million person organization that self-manages with new people every year. I mean, imagine, no company in Silicon Valley could come close to pulling that off, frankly, right? There's something amazing about that. And it works because of some of the discipline and the order around, regular performance reviews, and these are all good concepts done the right way. And so, I've found that people love transparency. They want to know how they're doing. They want to know where they're going. They want to know that their family's cared about and taken care of. So those are definitely lessons that have pulled through. Yeah, I mean, and I've always just tried to drive people really hard, almost to a point of exhaustion. And and when they're ready to go, then the one thing I would say that I've changed, and I'll just change the question a little bit, is like, what's different? And the biggest difference, I'll tell you, as a private sector guy, when I've got investors or when I've got a board, if I would have said, what's my job as a leader in the United States Army, I would have probably have said my job, at the core of my job, is to develop my people and manage them, develop my people the best I can every day, right? Make my team better, right? That's the great leader. And I always tell people that's not my job when I'm the CEO of a company. My job is to put the best field on the team every day. Going back to the early comments about who's right when. And so I kind of go in with a mindset, for better or for worse, for what it's worth, every day. If you're not if there's a better person for the job than you, my number one choice is probably to fire you and replace you. I hate to say that, but it's a mindset shift. And obviously there's cost to that, so you don't want to do that all the time. You'd have chaos. Because that's what keeps you from doing that. But your job's not to develop people when you're trying to move fast. Your job's to get the team right. And so just some additional color, I guess.
So, Mr. Chris Lynch, the question comes in terms of what has pleasantly surprised you in terms of talent management. What have you learned from your experiences here at the Department of Defense?
So this is one of the, I'll tell you a funny story. I knew very little about, the DoD or the government. I showed up for 45 days about 2.5 years ago. So I showed up initially for 45 days. That's both the joke and the punchline. And the interesting part about that is that I talked a little bit ago about mission. And one of the things that I actually find fascinating about this is, I showed up because, like so many people like me, I can remember when, I'll tell you this quick story. I remember watching you remember healthcare.gov when it launched and it didn't launch very well. And I'm a nerd, and I'm watching the news, and I remember it being talked about healthcare.gov and how it was doing so bad. And I said this exact statement to my wife. I was like, I could just do better myself. I could literally write the whole thing myself, and it would be better than what the government made. So that's the attitude I came in with. Was nobody's coming to save us, right? We have to, the nerds have to show up, we have to do this thing. But here's the really interesting part that I kind of mentioned when I did my introduction. General Nakasone has been witness to this as well. I mentioned that we went around and interviewed about 200 or so cyber soldiers. We kicked off everything in my office is about Star Wars. Actually, the sign on my office door says Rebel Alliance on it. So there's a program that we have, much like Hack the Pentagon, that's called Jyn Erso, which is one of the characters from Star Wars Rogue One. If you haven't seen it, I highly suggest it. And the first cohort, we generously got a group of incredible soldiers from Army Cyber, the schoolhouse, and a few other places, who came in to work side by side with my team on building something that hadn't been built. And you know what? They're just as good as the team that I hire. I hire top 1% talent in the United States. Top 1%. I mean, you can do searches around some of the people who have been on my team. They're some of the most well-known people that exist in tech. And they're just as good. I have 5 exceptional soldiers building something in my offices in the Pentagon that are just as good. I didn't know that that existed. Honestly, I didn't. I've learned a lot since I've shown up here, and a lot of it has probably changed me for the rest of my life. On many days I say it's the worst job that I've ever had, but then I have occasional moments where it's the best thing that I'll ever experience. And one of those things is truly some exceptional talent. And I'm going to tie this back to something that's really important, going back to the point that I was making around what's different, the question about what's different about this. Those 5 soldiers that we have working side by side with my engineers on something that is an incredible thing that they're developing in our offices, those 5 soldiers are worth multiples over anything else, at least in the technical front. Can't train it, they just are. They're great engineers. And they're in the Army. And I think that that's amazing. That should make us all proud and happy. But here's the thing. We have to get them into the place where they can work in a group like mine, right? Work in a partnership with General Nakasone on something that matters. Remove the bureaucracy. Remove the bullshit, right? Take all that away. Let them do a thing that matters. And I think that that's really important. So when I think of the thing that I have learned, it's that. We have amazing talent. Sometimes we just have them in the wrong place. So let's put them in the places where they can shine.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, just to synchronize our watches, it's 15:07 right now. We're going to take questions until about 15:15, and then have one closing question to all members of the panel. So have about 15 minutes left. So please send your questions in. So let me return to Steve Hager. So Steve, as you take a look at what you've been able to work on, both deployed in Southwest Asia and here in terms of your work with the National Mission Force, what has it been about your experiences with the soldiers and civilians that you're working with today that has surprised you the most?
Surprised me the most. So I actually echo what Chris had said. So as a youngster, I should say, back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I worked at, my first assignment was at the National Security Agency. On the technical side, tremendous capability, skill set. So I have to echo that. And now at the Cyber National Mission Force, have some young captains that do just some amazing work that I would say, some of them actually were industry before. And they left active duty, they did some stuff in industry, and they said they wanted to get back to do the mission, so they came back. And I think, one of my jobs is try to make sure we can retain them by giving them good mission sets. And the thing I've learned as a leader at the Cyber National Mission Force is I constantly ask them, am I challenging you enough? Because I think if the answer is they're not being challenged, that's when they're going to walk. And I think that's important. So sure, what I'd say the difference is as the O&M guy working for General Baker, running the network, running a network, at least the DODN part of the network, it's much more regimented. right? Because we have to make sure that we have things patched and stigged, and change management is very important. We can use some automation to maybe simulate the network to help us with incident, trouble ticketing and change management, so it's a much more regimented thing. And when I go to the Cyber National Mission Force, we've taken teams the services give us, right? We have national teams, support teams, and CPTs. And what we've done there is we've actually combined the teams. So we don't think of offensive, defensive teams. We actually think that latency between intelligence and operations intelligence, we're trying to make that near zero. Offensive cyber operations, defensive cyber operations. I'm trying to make that latency near zero. And to do that, you have to have skill sets, and you have to have trust, which is very important, and you have to have a network of people. And so the thing that's amazed me in my time is the depth and knowledge of my workforce, and the ability where what I also see in Silicon Valley is who they can go to ask questions of. And that gets back to being recognized by their peers, right? So in the tech sector, everybody want to work for these really cool guys that are leaders in their tech sector. Well, we know like the person who's called the top malware analyst, in the Navy. We have them in San Antonio, and my guys want to go talk to them. Or I have somebody who's really good at this type of access that they want to talk to. So in that small community, they get that reputation, and they're able to develop that. And so from my perspective, I think that's great. That's how we're building that skill set, and we want to, as you guys maybe call it, a beacon. I think that's how we're exemplifying it. And we actually have those individuals in our workforce, and I'm very proud to work with them.
So, Guy Filippelli, before you joined the Army and before you were a leader in industry, you were an academician, and you were a scholar, to include a Marshall Scholar, as I recall. The question that's come in here is, what do you see as the role for academia and the academic partnerships with universities? What role should the Army have, based upon your experiences, in encouraging such things as science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in the high schools or in cyber areas?
Yeah, I'll be probably maybe a little more critical of this than expected, but I kind of think academia is a little dangerous at the higher levels in general, right? So yes, I had some exposure to elite grad school kind of stuff, but academics. I think if you asked any private sector company how much do they focus on their academic relationships with big-time academics, they'd say, yeah, we focus on universities for recruiting. We try to get them early before they get too, mentally shape-shifted into being like a permanent student. And so, just to be fair on that, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Well done, Guy. Ladies and gentlemen, let me go ahead and move on to our last question. And the last question here is designed for each of our panelists to answer. And I'm going to start with Steve Hager, since I think he introduced this. And the question goes like this. We've heard a lot about Army Cyber 1.0 and a little bit about Cyber 2.0, Army Cyber 2.0. What does Army Cyber 3.0 look like? And what's the greatest missing element that we need to build as of now?
Sir, it's hard to predict the future, but I think what you have to do is you have to invest in trends, right? So we need to have a workforce that can identify trends, whether they be technological, social, or geopolitical, and based on that, trying to figure out how within the multi-domain battle that we can figure out where those investments are, and not just shiny objects, but with people, and how we're going to do that. And I think that's why my earlier comments of how Compo 2, Compo 3 can add to that, I really believe that as cyber is being recognized with the elevation of Cyber Command to be its own domain. Most of us know that, but now it's kind of acknowledged that will happen. I think we also should try to think of cyber as an instrument of national power. And if I look at the analogy of, say, the air domain, we have the greatest military air force in the world, but we also have a huge economic base that helps develop airplanes and so forth. We have a huge commercial sector that has people traveling around the world. And our government can use that as a tool, a lever, to influence other nations to do things. We can say, hey, Boeing's not going to be allowed to sell you aircraft. We're not going to allow flights into your country and back and forth. And I think we should have that discussion if cyber should go along that domain. And I think when you talk about cyber 3.0 or farther on, we should, at the academic level, have those discussions so the policymakers can help us put the resources to that if they so choose to go in that direction.
Thanks, Steve. Guy.
So, for me, first of all, having watched what has been accomplished, it is awesome, that the military, if you take a step back, that in a very, very short amount of time have built an organization that does have this much flexibility in it. Within the federal government, I think we ought to recognize that that's been a hell of an achievement. Not perfect yet, but it's getting there. That guys like Chris Lynch and Steve, are even in the room, in the jobs that they're in, is pretty amazing. I think the two areas that could really take it to another level, I think one I talked about a lot, leadership, and figuring out how the right technical leaders can be attached at all levels of the force. Because that's not always going to be the commander role, but I mean, just to be clear, and one more point on this, there are great companies in Silicon Valley that are not run by engineers. They're run by sales and marketing people. But I guarantee you they have strong engineering leadership within them. And great CEOs who come from sales marketing backgrounds know that well. That's what the first thing they do is they say, I got sales and marketing, but I'm going to make sure that my right hand is a technical badass leader, beacon, whatever we want to call them, right? The second thing, though, that I do want to touch on is this permeation concept, because I think that Steve said it in like 3 different times today, and it's such a powerful, the idea that we got to change the way people can come in and come out, and what we do with them when they leave. We talked about this, we had on a prior conversation, but when you think about who you want to emulate, really I'm saying, like, what system you want to run, right? What kind of offense, or what's the system? There are certain companies out there that make assumptions that they're not going to keep all their people, right? But they build and manage their alumni network accordingly. Goldman Sachs is a great example. They operate with the assumption that we're going to get somebody for 2 or 3 years. So they overhire at the bottom, They accept 60% attrition in the first few years, and then they take advantage of every single one of those people when they've left. Take advantage of every single one of them in a different way. They figure out a way. I think the Israelis do this as a military extremely well, where they embrace, you never know. I mean, I hate to say this, I love Israel, but we all kind of feel like we're not sure if somebody in Israel who's out of the military is still in it or not, when we're dealing with them, because they just do such a good job of keeping everybody connected, right? And so now, it's easy to say, tactical way, how the heck, I was just thinking, like, how do you do that, right? So for example, one of the challenges with our reserve system right now is that it's still binary. It's still like, you want to be in the reserves? Okay, it's a weekend a month, 2 weeks a year kind of thing, right? And in reality, I'm not going to impact the organization if I come in on the weekend and all the other people leave, right? So the reserve comes in that weekend and all the main people are gone. But imagine if you got to think of, like, take advantage of technology and think of like a reserve system where I could be in the reserves as like a reserve consultant. And I don't care what they pay, $50 an hour, but the whole point of it is, can I somehow get access to be there for a 2 p.m. meeting on a Thursday to talk about architecture, right? And that's where the geographics do come into play too. But think about that. If we could create the conditions where I could leave and I could stay connected to the force, and I could still participate and stay inspired, and that's what's going to also cause me to come back in. So and who says we can't do that? Right? So it's just, to me, it's thinking about how does the structure change to keep people more connected. By the way, and who owns who owns the alumni network to know it and keep it? Look at any great venture capital firm that really is the engine of all that innovation in the Valley. They know where every person they want to hire is. They track them. They spend a tremendous amount of money on tracking people once they've left, especially the good ones. So you're going to lose some of those 5, for sure, at one point. And really, in reality, there's hundreds, if not thousands of them, right? Who in the Army has the responsibility to track those people. You know, that's what makes that's what's going to make us great.
Thanks, Guy. Chris?
You know, I was sitting here listening to everybody's answers, and I was trying to think, what am I going to say about this? And I'll just make a couple observations, because I believe that humans are inherently not very good at predicting the future very well. 10 years ago, I had a BlackBerry. And I had just bought a BlackBerry. It was called the Pearl. It had just come out. And I remember showing people this phone, and I was like, "This is really cool. That's fine. This is what the DoD uses. It's fine. It's fine. It's actually not the story, but that's
That's the Army phone.
No, I know. This is real. This is happening. And I remember I just bought this, and then I watched the keynote where Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone, and I remember thinking, "Wow." It looked like, I remember this exact thought. It's almost like somebody had gone to the future, taken something from it, and then brought it back in time. Because I was comparing it to the BlackBerry Pearl. Well, you could compare it to this too, but this one's newer. And my reason for bringing that up is because that was just 10 years ago. Think of how much your life has changed in 10 years. The entire lighting system in my house is controlled by an Amazon Echo. I say turn on the living room lights. They automatically turn on, really, for the most part, right? I can change them any color just by saying the color I want, right? Some ways I think of these things, and I think back 10 years ago, that didn't exist. Those things didn't exist. And it's really funny when you think about that, because it's the difficulty that we have is that it comes down to one incredible thing, and I feel like Guy and Steve and I probably can all relate to this very important thing. The only constant is change. And it is also the most uncomfortable thing that exists. Humans hate change, right? You know how Facebook, they change like an icon, and people are like, "Oh my God, they changed an icon," right? And they go insane, and they're like, "Don't like this on Facebook," and there's all these little things that are going around, and it's like, Jesus, it's just an icon change. And if you think about it, that's actually part of the difficulty in an organization the size of the Department of Defense, right? Because when you have millions of people who are connected to this thing, it is the constant. But cyber is even faster. It's even faster. New frameworks are released nearly once a month at the very least, if not weekly. New frameworks, that's new vulnerabilities, that's new weaknesses, that's new opportunity. There's a new opportunity in there, right? Every week. How does that work in a world where the acquisition of things can take sometimes years? How does that work in a way that we think about our traditional instructional models? How does that work in a world where we have a concept that's called 0 days, right? It doesn't. That's actually the answer. The answer is it doesn't. So when I think about what all of this is, what does it mean? Where are we going? And without making any broad predictions, I can tell you the characteristics that ultimately are important to startups in particular, but to whatever we want to become. And one is, we are incredibly adaptable to the change that we did not ever assume would exist. Because one day you bought the BlackBerry Pearl, and then I bought a new phone for $700 3 months later, and it was called the iPhone. That was a true story. I was like, holy crap. I just bought another phone just a couple months before. But that was okay, because I knew that it was the right thing. We have to change. So change is the constant thing. We have so many words that we use in the Department of Defense that I've never heard any place else. We come up with spiral and all these other things. I don't know what any of that means. But I'll say this. We're really good at iterating. We're really good at adapting. We're really, really good at removing the barriers and the bureaucracy that allow rational and reasonable decisions to be made and be implemented without stepping on our own feet, right? Without tripping over our own shoestrings. that, to me, is at the end of the day, the only thing that I can imagine that we want to be. Because that will actually give us the things that we want in order to be A, superior in a incredibly important domain, which I would just broadly say, you could say cyber or technology, right? No different and no less important than air, land, and sea. And it allows us to actually deliver the results that we expect and defend ourselves, our nation, the people that we care about, and do the mission of defense. So I don't know what all the things are, and I'm not going to predict the future because maybe this will become popular again. I don't know. But probably not. But that was a joke. That was a joke. But I do think that that is the thing. Change is the constant, and it will happen faster and faster. Nobody is coming to save us, right? We have to do this ourselves. And I do know that, and I believe in that deeply.
Thanks, Chris. John.
I appreciate everybody's comments. I'm going to take just a little bit different tact. So version 2.0, version 3.0, version 4.0, spirals, iterating. I'll tell you what I consider the missing linchpin to get to any version that you want to throw out there. And quite frankly, it's changing ourselves. And I'm talking about from a cultural perspective. The underpinnings that both Guy and Chris sort of laid out for you are in the art of the possible. I firmly believe that. I don't think there's anything that our Army cannot accomplish. However, I will tell you that we've got permafrost out there that are underlying inside our bureaucracy that inhibit really that creative change and that creative thought and that innovation that we need in this space. So we can actually see what version 3.0 is. And so the missing component from my perspective is that underlying challenge on the bureaucracy that makes it adaptable and flexible, that turns loose the human spirit that is inside our Army. And if we don't get that right and we let the permafrost run amok, it will inhibit our progress. And I will tell you, and I don't want to speak for General Nakasone, but we spend an inordinate amount of time making the bureaucracy work for us, when the reality of it is it should be enabling this innovative thought that you heard both Guy and Chris and Steve talk about. So to get to version 3.0, that missing piece, it's ourselves and changing the culture in which we operate. We talked about talent management a lot today, but it is a change in paradigm in how we need to manage folks. And it doesn't need to be company commander, battalion commander, brigade commander. We need to come up with a way that changes the way that we manage our talent so we're smart and efficient about it, and we harvest all the innovation that people can bring to us. And quite frankly, when somebody's not a part of that team that Guy so eloquently described, then maybe we need to find somewhere else in the Army to use their talents. But the underlying component that we all need to be mindful of, because we do have a ton of momentum right now, is allowing it to fall back into the old way of managing our people, managing our capabilities, managing everything when it comes to cyber. Because I don't want to sound like Debbie Downer here. If we don't force that change, then we will find ourselves in a predicament where the enemy will make us change.
Thanks, John. So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all of us in the Army Cyber Enterprise, thank you for your attendance today here on the third day of AUSA. Thank you for support of our Army, and thank you for support of the Army Cyber Enterprise. Have a great day. Appreciate it.
So when I was in Southwest Asia, I had a smartphone, right? Well, thanks a lot.